don't forget to look at the KJ pages, and you are going to have everything you need in terms of learning Torah. So first of all, I want to thank, each and every year, the Shabbat HaGadol Drasha is sponsored by Susie and Larry Present, and I want to once again thank them for their sponsorship. Before I begin, I want to say that the zchut, the merit of all of the words of Torah that we are studying should be a merit for all of those who are ill, and that God should send them immediately a refuah shlema, a speedy and full recovery. We have so many members of our community that we are davening for, and we continue to daven for them. So tonight's topic begins with yachatz. We all know yachatz. We take the matzah, we take the smaller piece, and we keep it there. The larger piece goes and gets hidden for later in the Seder. And yachatz is, of course, when you're a child, is something that you focus on, because the larger piece is the afikomen. And if you manage to get the afikomen, then you can get a gift. And so every child focuses on yachatz, but yachatz actually has a very unusual foundation. And its foundation really starts with the pasuk in Sefer Devarim, which you have on your sheets. It's on sheet number 1. And it's a pasuk in Sefer Devarim. It's a verse in the book of Deuteronomy in the 16th chapter. It's the 3rd pasuk. It's the 3rd verse. And in this particular pasuk, it says that matzos are lechem oni, which literally means a bread of affliction. Now, the meaning of this term is somewhat debated. And we'll see in a moment a very inventive way that Rav David Tzvi Hoffman sort of tries to integrate the reading of the Talmud with what might be the simple reading. But it is a very strange phrase. And then the pasuk continues and says, Ki b'chipazon yatzatza me'eretz Mitzrayim. Now, ki very often will mean because you left Egypt very quickly. So the question is what exactly is this affliction that we are referring to in lechem oni? Now, those who explain the Torah according to Pshat will say that lechem oni simply means a bread poorly baked because you left quickly. And then this pasuk is very consistent with what we saw in Sefer Shemos, that the reason why we eat matzah is because the Jews rushed out of Egypt and they didn't have a chance for their bread to bake and to rise. So this is one way of reading the pasuk, but that's not the way that many in Chazal read the pasuk, and their reading is going to be the reason why we do yachatz. And if you look in the Sifrei, we already have amongst the Tanaim, Rabbi Shimon says, Lama nikra lechem oni, why is it called a bread of affliction? Al shem inui shenis anu b'Mitzrayim, because of the affliction they had in Egypt. So lechem oni, according to Rabbi Shimon, is actually a reflection of the affliction the Jews had in Egypt. Now, we'll see in a moment that this opinion embraces the idea that Jews ate matzah while they were slaves. Now, the idea that Jews ate matzah while they were slaves is not strange, because matzah is a bread that's baked very quickly. If you're a slave, you don't have the time to bake the bread well. And so if you need to bake it very quickly, so then you're going to bake a bread that doesn't rise. So the idea that perhaps the Jews as slaves were eating matzah is not foreign from the possible experience. It seems to fit well with the experience. And Rabbi Shimon says that this is actually what the pasuk in Devarim is saying. And when you get to the Gemara, which is the Gemara in Psachim at the bottom of sheet number 1, so there are several interpretations given to lechem oni. One is lechem oni is a bread in which we're going to speak much about it, which is purely drash. It's purely a homiletical reading, meaning the matzah is going to be at the center of the Seder, and we're going to tell all sorts of stories about leaving Egypt as we put the matzah at the center of the Seder. The third interpretation is just like a poor person, he and his wife are baking together. Because a poor person, one needs to roll out the dough and the other one needs to get the oven going because they need to get it right in very, very quickly. They only have a certain amount of wood. And so the dough, there needs to be a very careful coordination because the wood is going to burn out pretty quickly. So they're going to have to bake in a very rapid fashion and not let the dough rise in any way. So this is an idea that this is lechem oni. It really means the lechem ani, the lechem of a poor person. And a poor person will bake very rapidly. And it really has no relevance to actually what the experience in Egypt is. But actually, the middle interpretation seems to refer to the experience in Egypt. And the middle interpretation in the Gemara in Psachim says, Ma ani shedargo beprusa afkan beprusa. just like a poor person eats only a portion of his bread. And what this means is that if a poor person is given a loaf of bread, he doesn't know whether or not he's going to have bread tomorrow. So he never eats the full loaf of bread because he's frightened that he might not get food tomorrow. And so a poor person, a person who is in difficult and in distressing circumstances, will have a little bit of the bread now and leave a lot of the bread till tomorrow because he doesn't know what tomorrow might bring. There might not be any bread tomorrow. And this is the interpretation upon which Yachatz is based. And so Yachatz is essentially in a way of showing that this is a bread of affliction. This is a bread which a poor man would eat in a certain fashion, in which he would remove a piece, eat it now, and leave the rest for later. Now, this means that we are embracing a particular reading of the Pasuk in Devarim. The Pasuk in Devarim is saying that the Jews didn't only eat matzah when they rushed out of Egypt, they ate matzah for 400 years when they were slaves. And let me repeat that, because not everybody recognizes this. When you break the bread at Yachatz, you're essentially embracing an interpretation that says this is a poor man's bread, which means you're embracing an interpretation that the matzah is a symbol of the 400 years of slavery as well. And indeed, as David Henschke notes, our current reading of the first paragraph in the Haggadah, and there's a different version in the Rambam and in the Sephardic Haggadahs, but our reading of the first paragraph of the Haggadah says, "Ha-lach ma'anya di'achlu avasana ba'ara de Mitzrayim." This is the poor man's bread, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. And presumably this is a reference to the 400 years of slavery. And if you're on sheet number 2, at the bottom, the Ramban actually says that. He says that the matzah has actually 2 meanings to it. One is that it's a symbol of the rapid release and the rapid exodus from Egypt, where there was no opportunity to bake the bread. And the other one is that for 400 years, everybody was baking bread very, very quickly, and everybody was eating a bread that was a poor man's bread, where maybe they took a piece of a loaf today and left the rest of the loaf for tomorrow, and that the matzah is also a symbol of the bread eaten during slavery. Now, this is something that as the Seforno puts, maybe it's ironic. It's ironic that actually the same symbol that represents slavery ends up becoming the symbol that represents their freedom. And we'll talk about that a little bit further when we talk about Rav Soloveitchik's reading of this. But there's an interesting passage in the commentary of Rabbi David Abudriam, or Abudraham, as he's very often pronounced, about this idea, where he talks about, and this is on the top of page 3, where he talks about the fact that someone told him that when Avram ibn Ezra, I assume it's Avram ibn Ezra, it might have been Moshe ibn Ezra, but that when Avram ibn Ezra was put in a jail in India, they gave him a matzah type bread, and he never gave him a bread that rises. And they say because a little bit of matzah is something that can feed you for a longer time because it is not digested as quickly. And therefore that's why they would feed matzah to the slaves. So this is an idea that maybe comes from a different angle with Avudraham. I would just say simply is that people were baking very quickly at home because they're slaves. But the idea here is that Yachatz represents the concept of matzah being a bread of slavery. An idea that maybe is not necessarily one that every mefarash, every interpreter of the simple reading of the text would say is so. But this is an idea that, as we see in the Ramban and ultimately in the paragraph of Halach Ma'anya, becomes a very important idea, and it's embraced by Rabbi Shimon in the Sifrei, and it's embraced by the Gemara in Pesachim. So matzah is a bread of slavery, and at the same time, it is a bread of freedom. What are the implications of this? Well, first I want to talk about a few halachic implications, and then talk about what I think is the biggest theological implication. The halachic implications come up right away when you look on page 3. Tosfos has a problem with matzah because you're supposed to recline when you eat matzah, and you're only supposed to recline when you're eating foods that symbolize freedom. Now, if matzah symbolizes slavery, so Tosos and Psachim on Daf Kufches says, that's very strange. You wouldn't recline during something that's a symbol of slavery. It seems to undermine the meaning of that symbol, because reclining is fundamentally a way of showing freedom. If matzah is meant to communicate slavery, it communicates freedom too. But if it's meant to communicate slavery, reclining when you eat it seems to undermine at least that aspect of what matzah is about. And Rav Soloveitchik tries to explain what Tosfos is trying to say. And Rav Soloveitchik says something that's very powerful that actually, it related in some ways to my mother's experience, which I'll explain in a moment. Rav Soloveitchik tries to explain, and he uses what is a traditional concept in Lamdus of the difference between a gavra and a chefza, the difference between a subject and an object, or a subjective way of looking at things and an objective way of looking at things. And Rav Soloveitchik says, objectively, matzah is a symbol of slavery because the Jews ate it for 400 years of slavery. However, the experience the Jews had on the night of Pesach, the experience they had the next morning, is that they ate matzah at their Seder in Egypt, and the bread that they baked did not rise and turned into matzah. So their subjective experience as they were standing before God, as God came to redeem them, is that their matzah had a different meaning, because to them, their experience of matzah on that night was an experience of it being a freedom. Now, the Sforno may say this is ironic, but there's a difference between an objective vision of matzah, which matzah is a symbol of slavery, because nobody who could really bake bread properly would bake matzah. They'd want to have nice bread. On Shabbos, you don't want to have matzah, you want to have nice challahs. But that's the objective view. But the subjective view is that depending on your own experience with it, it becomes something else. And on the night of Pesach, the individual subjective experience of matzah is different than the overall objective experience of matzah. And so when you have matzah at halach ma'anya and you have it on the Seder plate, that represents slavery. But when you sit down to eat it, as the Jews were eating in the Seder in Egypt before God, then your personal experience of matzah is one of freedom, because at this moment it means freedom. And it reminds me of something my mother told me about when she was liberated after World War II. So she said that the food that she ate, which was army rations, that food, she says, she could never reproduce the beauty of the taste of that food. It was probably terrible tasting food. But to someone who was just liberated and just starving and just depressed, that food was the sweetest tasting food on earth. And so the objective experience of what army rations are, we would say objectively that's inferior food. The subjective experience is one of that this is something remarkable and something beautiful. And that's what Rav Soloveitchik is saying about matzah. Objectively, matzah is a symbol of slavery. No one bakes matzah if they have to. Matzah is a poor man's bread. It is a bread of affliction. It's a bread that's baked quickly by those who don't have the opportunity to bake properly. But the subjective experience is different. And therefore, you can recline when you are imitating the subjective experience. Because even though it is an objectively, it is a symbol of slavery, that's not what it is subjectively. And just to continue with another halachic area of investigation, which has to do with whether or not it's a dual symbol, and has a lot to do with Rav Soloveitchik's particular reading of the dual symbol, is a very famous debate between the Maharal of Prague and the Magen Avram about what happens if you don't have pure regular matzah at the Seder. We know that there's regular matzah, which is made out of bread and water, but then there are fancier matzahs that could be made out of eggs or out of apple juice and other types of products. Ashkenazim tend not to use them. Actually, our practice is not to use them. Sephardic Jews are welcome to use them. This is one of those areas where the Ramah is more machmir than the Machaber regarding Pesach, like many other things. And on Pesach, I think a lot of Ashkenazic Jews have Sephardic envy. But in any case, the question arises is what happens if you don't have regular matzah and the only matzah that you have for the Seder is egg matzah? Now, the Gemara says that matzah needs to be a bread of affliction, a poor man's bread. And therefore, that excludes using egg matzahs for the Seder because it's not a simple, it's not a poor bread. You're already including all sorts of other ingredients and making it a very tasty bread. It's not a poor bread. It's not a simple bread. So the question arises is, well, let's say you don't have it. Can you then use egg matzah at the Seder? The Maharal of Prague says, makes sense that if you have no other choice, you can still do the mitzvah of eating matzah at the Seder with egg matzah, because you're still doing what he calls be'erev tochlu matzos. But to give sort of the background, he's saying you're still eating a matzah that represents the rapid exodus from Egypt. It may not be a matzah that represents slavery, but an egg matzah can represent freedom because it's still a flat bread. The Magen Avram disagrees, and I think the Magen Avram can be understood in using Rav Soloveitchik's view, is that the matzah fundamentally has to be a bread of slavery. It is just how it's eaten and when it's eaten that it becomes a bread of freedom. So the chefza, so the object, needs to be a bread of slavery. But the concept of that night, the subjective experience, is that it is a bread of freedom. So this is, at least I believe that Rav Soloveitchik's view would also come down on the side of the Magen Avram against the Maharal. But this is, of course, because we have a tradition always to talk a little bit of words of halacha at the Seder. I wanted to start with that and to note that the idea that matzah is a symbol of slavery itself has halachic ramifications. But here comes the theological question, and one that even when I was much younger was one that bothered me at the Seder. And it's one that really fundamentally goes with matzah being a symbol of slavery. Of the three foods that are biblically warranted that we eat at the Seder, so Pesach, of course, represents the fact that the houses were jumped over, were skipped over, or were mercifully excluded by God. And then Marar, at least according to Rabbi Gamliel and the Mishnah that we read at the Seder, Marar is a representation of the bitterness of slavery. And matzah, as we said, is quite possibly a symbol of both slavery and freedom. And that actually makes it a little bit more interesting because it's a dual symbol, and it seems to say that maybe the stories of slavery and freedom are intertwined. And slavery is not just sort of the background of talking about freedom at the Seder, but actually slavery and freedom somehow have a relationship with each other. And I want to get back to that at the end, but I want to start by posing the very simple question. We have symbols of slavery at the Seder. The Torah tells us to use symbols of slavery at the Seder. Now, the slavery is something that poses a very large theological question that, by the way, the Haggadah sort of glosses over and never gets involved with. And that is how is it that, well, thank you, Lisa. I got a glass of water, just like in shul. So how is it that we were slaves for 400 years in Egypt? And we're crediting God for redeeming us from Egypt. But what about putting us into slavery for 400 years? And on page 4, of course, I have the well-known pasuk where God tells Avram, who's not Avraham yet, but he's Avram. He says, you should know that your descendants are going to be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and they will be oppressed. The inu, actually the same word of lechem oni, for 400 years. So God tells Avraham, your descendants are going to be slaves for 400 years. So we're thanking God for the freedom that we experienced on the night of Pesach. But there are 400 years of why. Why were we slaves for 400 years? Now, this, of course, in many ways overlaps with the question of why bad things happen to good people. But that's going to be something we're going to talk about in a moment. That's not going to be my focus ultimately. But it is a difficult question. And one has to grapple with what is the meaning of slavery. And the fact that the Torah wants us not just to remember freedom, but to remember slavery. And if in the matzah itself, the Torah is telling us that the two are commemorated in the very same object, even if one is through the subjective and one is through the objective, but the two are commemorated in the very same food. What exactly is it trying to tell us about these 400 years? So first, let's talk for a moment about approaches to why bad things happen to good people. Now, I'll start just by saying that my own personal preference and my own personal belief is that there is no answer to this question. This is a view that already is found in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos by Rav Yanai, who says, "Ein biyadenu," it is not in our hands to understand why Yisurei Tzadikim, why it is that the righteous are going to be afflicted. This is a view that Rav Soloveitchik embraced. And personally, I have to tell you, it's a view that I remember in my earliest stay in the rabbinate, I had invited someone to actually speak about this topic. And she was giving a lecture on why bad things happen to good people. And in giving this lecture, she was giving the lecture before a survivor. In the room, there was a survivor of the Holocaust. And he slowly but surely got angrier and angrier, and ultimately started to get up and ask questions and to even yell and disrupt the lecture. And I realized that, you know, I always say is at the time I felt bad for the lecturer. And as I got older, I felt bad for the survivor, because I realized that talking about this question is a difficult one. And even tonight, although this is really a way of sort of unrolling what we have to say, and this is not what I'm going to be looking at, it is a difficult question. But in medieval history, there's been different approaches to it. And what we're going to see when the Mefarshim talk about why the Jews were slaves for 400 years, they're essentially going to fall into two different types of schools. There's going to be the school that says it's based on sin, and there's going to be the school that says it's based on the development of the people. And this, in many ways, is very similar to two schools of thought that John Hick, in one of the most important books on theology, Evil and the God of Love, talks about how there are two schools, there are two ways of seeing the problem of evil and sort of trying to resolve it. And one is, he calls it the Augustinian, which is based on the views of Augustine, is that God is not responsible for evil at all, and that if there's evil in this world, it's because man has sinned and man has failed and man has done something wrong. And that we're going to see look, it's not a foreign idea to the Jewish tradition, and it may have a lot to do with the words in Musaf of Mifnei Chata'enu Galinu Me'artzenu, because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. But then there's a second view. He calls it the Irenaean view, but it's one that's actually perhaps a little more modern, that evil is part of God's creation of this world. And it actually makes the world better because the imperfections, as Hick puts it, are integral to its fitness as a place of soul-making. That the world is a place of soul-making, and that crisis and difficulty is part of the way that we develop our souls. Now, that might sound compelling unless you're the person who's suffering. And that's why I find that both of these answers fall flat. But ultimately, when we look at how the Mefarshim relate to this issue, they will come to very similar conclusions. And they will sort of look at things in a very similar way. And if you're on sheet number 5, which has 2 photographs of Hick's book, because I'm not in shul, and so I'm not scanning, and so I'm using photographs for whatever I'm putting in. On sheet number 5, we look at a whole series of sources, whether it be the Derech Hashem or the Noda B'Yehuda in his in the introduction to the Tzlach, his commentary to Pesachim, where he says that maybe the Jews went into exile because of the sin of Adam HaRishon. And then you get to the Gemara Nedarim, which is on page 6, which blames the 400 years of exile on misbehavior by Avraham. And the Gemara Nedarim offers 3 theories. It says first that maybe the reason why Avraham, why the 400 years of slavery were decreed was because Avraham had drafted Talmidei Chachamim. This, of course, whenever there's a discussion or debate about the appropriateness of sending yeshiva students to the army, this is very often marshaled up as source number 1. But it says that Abraham was punished because he had drafted Torah scholars. The second reason given is that Abraham had shown doubt when God promised him that his descendants would come to the land, and he had shown a lack of faith. And the third one is that Abraham, in the same war, the war of the 5 kings, or he was on the side of the 5 kings against the 4 kings. And Abraham, when he fought in that war, he was offered to take the people who were captured. And Abraham should have taken them because he would have then brought them to Jewish practice. He would have converted them. And Abraham was punished for not taking them and converting them. So these are 3 reasons given by the Gemara Nedarim. The third reason, of course, is also interesting in its own right because it sheds light on what at least this Gemara thinks about conversion. And this is a theme that we find elsewhere. In other words, that maybe Abraham is getting punished. Maybe it's the sin of Abraham that ended up causing the Jews to be enslaved for 400 years. The Ramban on page 7 offers a different theory. He says that when Abraham goes down with his wife to Egypt the first time, God tells him to go to the land of Israel. And then there's a famine. And so Abraham decides to go to Egypt to find food. So the Ramban says that was a sin. And not only was that a sin, But because he went to Egypt, his descendants were then decreed to become enslaved in Egypt. This is the Ramban's theory. And then you go on, and there are other theories. One that's actually perhaps the most popular amongst the Rishonim is that it's because of the sin of the sale of Joseph, because that really has a much closer connection. Joseph was sold as a slave, and therefore the Jews had to be enslaved in the land of Egypt. And the Gemara in Megillah on Daf Tezayin Amud Beis actually says that it's because of the jealousy that Yaakov created and stirred up with the brothers by giving Yosef a special garment, a special jacket, is what caused the Jews to go into slavery in Egypt. And it's basically looking at Yaakov and saying, well, maybe you shouldn't have bought Yosef that special coat. And this is sort of a chaos theory, but it's expanded by Don Isaac Abravanel, who says, you know, the Jews, the brothers sold Yosef into slavery. And that's where all of the slavery starts, not only in terms of it being a midah neged midah punishment, a measure for measure punishment, but also had Yosef not been sold into slavery, we would have never gone into Egypt. And then finally, one of the other theories that has to do with what sin it is that brought the Jews to Egypt, many of them center around psukim in the 20th chapter of Yechezkel. Now, the psukim themselves could be read in more than one way, but Rabbi Ovadia Misaforno says the reason why the Jews are slaves in Egypt is because the Jews living in Egypt were worshiping idols. And the Ralbag, pointing to the episode in the beginning of Moshe's life, where he meets the two Jews fighting, and he says, why are you fighting? And the two Jews turn on him. So the Ralbag points to that and says, look at their terrible character. And that's why they're getting punished to be slaves in Egypt, because the people who are slaves are the ones who are actively sinning. And so this is one school of thought, that the Jews are in slavery for 400 years because there is a sin that they are being punished for. It might have been the sin of Adam. It might have been the sin of Avram Avinu. It might have been the sin of Yosef, of the brothers of Yosef. It might have been the sins of the Jews themselves in Egypt. But essentially, what happens in the 400 years of exile can be attributed to the sins of the Jews. Now, if you're trying to understand why bad things happen to good people, so then this fits a slot, if you're willing to take that slot. You know why the Jews were slaves for 400 years? Because there was a sin to be punished. Now, I'll talk in a moment why the reason why I'm bringing this is not to talk about theodicies, so to speak, to talk about how to solve the problem of why bad things happen to good people, or why a God of good would allow evil into the world. But actually, what I really want to talk about is how we see history and how we see ourselves in times of difficulty, because that's ultimately what I want to get to. But then I want to show you the other point of view, what Hick would call the Irenaean point of view, which really is in many ways very spiritually compelling, in which there are several reasons given for why this exile at least enriches us spiritually. And one could offer a theory saying that we needed to be slaves, and some will actually say this, as we'll see in a moment, we needed to be slaves to prepare us for our spiritual mission. So one that obviously you can point to, which is found multiple times in the Torah, is that being a slave gives us a sensitivity towards strangers. Strangers, of course, are like us when we were in Egypt. We didn't have anyone that would take care of us, and we were treated differently because we were strangers. And the idea of reaching out to the stranger to make someone who is not comfortable feel at home is an idea that the Torah repeats over and over again, that charity is not just about those who are close to you, but it is about those who are far from you. And again, embracing the stranger is such a critical idea to Judaism, and it is always related to the 400 years of servitude, the 400 years in which we were treated as strangers by the Egyptians. But then there are other theories, and if you look on page 9, you have the Ramban, who talks about a possibility of that the slavery enabled us to be servants of God. You have the Ran, who talks about the idea that perhaps slavery, so to speak, weakens the material side of man. And actually, in one of his drashot, in the 10th drasha, and that's why I say look at the drasha Ran in the 10th drasha, the Ran there talks about the Black Plague. And when grappling with the Black Plague, he calls it, as he does call slavery, Yisurin Shel Ava, a phrase from the Talmud in Brachos, that this is an affliction of love. And that essentially what is happening is that there are times where the punishment actually just increases your character and makes your character stronger. And to the Ran, the strength of the character that goes through slavery or goes through the Black Plague of 1348 and 1349 is that now you lose your attachment to material goods and become more spiritual. But perhaps my favorite of these sort of character building explanations is one that's found in the Otzer Midrashim, which is from a midrash that Eisenstein found called Psikta Chadata. And in the Otzer Midrashim, it says that before the Jews went into slavery, one Jew might treat, one of the brothers might treat some of the other brothers who were children of the maidservants with a lack of respect. And after going to slavery, where everybody was a slave together, all of a sudden, everybody was on an equal footing, and there was a stronger sense of solidarity. And so the experience of the bitterness of slavery actually builds greater solidarity. And this, by the way, is incredibly true after crises. Again, I look at Jewish history and I see what happens at the establishment of the State of Israel, which is 3 years after the Holocaust. From the communists to Agudas Yisrael, they all get together and they sign on the Declaration of Independence of Israel, because there is this solidarity, there is this understanding that everybody has to come together. And then, of course, as the state becomes more comfortable and stronger, the solidarity gets lost. And so there is this sense, which the Otzer Midrashim, this Midrash and Otzer Midrashim is saying, is that going into slavery gave the Jews greater solidarity. And so we have two schools. We have the school of thought that the Jews are punished for sins, and that's why they spent 400 years in slavery. And then there's a school of thought that it is actually meant to help build the Jewish character. Like I said twice, and this is going to be the third time I said it, this is not my understanding of why bad things happen to good people. But I do think it's important for us to consider the implications of these two views, because they have a lot to do with how we look back at difficult times and how we look back at periods of crisis. Most importantly, it has a lot to do with how Jews, once they created the State of Israel, how they looked back at their predecessors who lived in exile. And one of the staples of early Zionist thought is the Galut Jew, the Jew from exile. It starts well before the Zionists, because Avi Ravitsky, and I have this quote from him where he quotes Moses Mendelssohn being asked whether or not the Jews would want to resettle in Palestine, which for Mendelssohn was a very difficult question for a whole bunch of other reasons. And Mendelssohn basically said, my people are not capable of building a state. This becomes one of the themes about Galut. And there's a terrific article by Eliezer Dan Yechia who talks about the changing view of what's called Shlilat HaGolah, seeing the entire experience of exile as negative. And if you look at, let's say Jabotinsky, Ze'ev Jabotinsky will talk about the difference between the Galuti, Yehudi HaGaluti, the Gullus Jew, and the Jew, the new Jew that he was trying to create, who would settle the land of Israel. And for at least the first 12, 13, 14 years of the State of Israel, this was a staple of Israeli thought. So much so that survivors actually of the Holocaust were sometimes embarrassed to say that they were survivors. Now this is, as he points out, changes with the Eichmann trial in 1960. But the idea that maybe we have two perspectives on what 400 years of exile or 2,000 years of exile can mean, forgetting about the question of theodicy, it is a question also of history. Do you see the years of exile as fundamentally empty years? Do you see them simply as a punishment, as something that is negative, that is unworthy of any connection to the future? Or do you see the times of exile, and if I may add, times of crisis, is actually something that within history we can be proud of, and something that we see as creating character? Now, I think the Israeli view has changed dramatically, and that looking back at exile, there's a greater appreciation for what it was to be a Jew during times when you were under the gun, when your life was in danger. I remember years ago going to Beersheba on a mission, and when they would take, it was a Federation leadership mission, and so they would have a panel and there would be a discussion, and it was actually a discussion about agriculture in the South, because Israel had made the desert bloom by bringing irrigation and creating farms in the South. And then there was a question about whether or not this is really what Israel should be looking to do in the future. And there was a young economist who was talking about essentially it was a waste of time and that we should be using our time to build high tech. And he was probably right. But On the other side was one of the earlier settlers in Beersheba after the creation of the state of Israel, a fellow by the name of Menachem Perlmutter. And he was talking about growing strawberries. Now, while he was talking about growing strawberries, I couldn't take my eyes off his forearm. It was a warm day and he was wearing short sleeves and he had a number tattooed on his forearm. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. And I was thinking to myself, here you have a survivor of the Holocaust. And now he's talking about growing strawberries in the south of Israel in the desert. And what a remarkable story that is. A man who has been exposed to such death, and he wants to make life bloom, even in the middle of a desert. And to me, I think this is now the new way of looking at what this experience of Galut means. It means that actually there is a greater love for freedom, a love for humanity, and a love for life. And a love for life doesn't make you weaker, it makes you stronger. One of the staples of the propaganda of terrorists during the years of the Intifada is that you Jews love life and we love death. And this was a statement you could find hundreds of times by hundreds of spokesmen for the various terror groups. And it was essentially a way of saying that if you love death, you're stronger. And they're absolutely wrong. Loving life is what makes you stronger. And in some ways, our years in Galut, our years in exile, made us stronger because we understood how important it is to have a state, how important it is to have freedom, how important it is to love human beings, and how important it is to love life. And that is what has made Israel such a strong state. And so when we look back at Lechemoni, and we look back at why is it in the Seder, why do we have a symbol that connects slavery and freedom in one? Because I think it's trying to teach us that sometimes the greatest lessons of freedom are found in slavery, that you only recognize how important it is to appreciate freedom if you can taste a little bit of the bitterness of slavery, and you have a different experience of freedom, a less arrogant and a much more appreciative one than you would if you never had slavery before. This is not an explanation of the 400 years in exile. And for that, we can still ask God questions every day. But once we had those 400 years of exile, how do we see ourselves? We see ourselves as being stronger. And that ultimately, I think, is one of the great lessons of the Seder. Our ups and downs in history have not made us weaker. They've made us more resilient and stronger. And as we enter a Seder that is unlike any other, in which we will not be able to be with each other because of the coronavirus crisis, we have to recognize that every time Jews have faced a crisis, we have become stronger. May God protect us and watch over us and give us health. And may he allow us to find within our hearts the strength and the courage to meet each and every day. I just want to end with a blessing again. May God bless you and your families with joy, with happiness, and with health. Chag Sameach.